Before we get started on the message today, one of the things that I want to do is show you a couple photos. It was a random Tuesday about 3 weeks ago where I was sitting in my office, and Amy King and I, who is our care coordinator and helps make the world work around Liberty, trust me. She and I were sitting, putting out some fires when we got a knock at the door, and someone said, "Can I get a tour of the church?" And we were like, "Oh man, I don't have time for this." You know what I mean? Is there anyone who can do that? I'm just teasing. We were so gracious and everything. Anyway, they knock on the door and they're like, "Can we get a tour?" And we're like, "Oh, is there anyone we can find to go do that? Because we got this stuff we got to do." Until we found out who they were. Guess who they were? We'll show a picture here. These were two of the guys that built this barn that we're standing in. And so we have a little blue book that has pictures of guys that are like walking on these beams and rafters. And as we were walking around, that's Melvin there in the front. There's a picture of him actually standing right up here with no ropes or harnesses or anything on. He was telling us a story that one time he did fall and hurt his leg. He had to stop working for a few weeks. That's crazy. But it was so special to get to spend time with these guys. And they were telling us stories of how things were built and how everything was working. Of course, unabashedly, I was like, "So, does this crack over here matter? Can you tell me what's going on with this beam? Are we in trouble here?" And I loved his response. He goes, he had more patience with the building than I think a normal person would. And he goes, "I think you guys are going to be okay. You should probably just cherish it and appreciate it and enjoy it." And I was like, "Man, that's totally what we're going to do." And I still brought in another guy the next week to look at a few of the cracks. That wasn't Amish, and that's okay. We walk in both worlds here. There's a couple more photos where we were just walking around the campus, and they were reliving some of the memories from that time. But we've got books around here that tell the stories of Liberty, that tell the stories of construction. One of the things that I am amazed by is when people walk into this building, they think that it's the oldest building on campus. And this is our newest building. This was built in the 90s, people. I was going into, I'm not going to tell you how old I was, but it's either too old for some or it shames our seniors here. So we won't date ourselves, but I do know this. Our oldest building is right over there where our chapel is. For Heritage Sunday, one of the things that we are doing this year that we haven't done since COVID is we are celebrating this, and it's wonderful. And so you can go learn more about the church in the chapel. So after the service, you can go over there. There's folks in the chapel that will kind of give you a tour and tell you all about it. It's going to be, Tracy, you're working on that, right? And so there's lots of folks that are doing this. There's food downstairs. The guys were cooking chicken at 6 a.m. here when I won't tell you how early we get here, but it's just awesome to take time to do this. Anytime a church or a nation or a person tells you their story, do you think they tell a good version of it, a real version of it, or a bad version of it? They tell a good version. If you were going to an ancient museum and you were wanting to learn about what happened in ancient Egypt back in the day, what you do is you find these stones, and it has a king that would tell someone what to start carving down to tell the story. And this is how they often go. "I, King Blank, was the king of this great land from these years, and we killed all of these people and dominated their lands. We took these people as slaves, and we built these construction buildings, and here I stand to tell you how great and wonderful I am in this land that we have." That's how it goes, right? And so that's how the kings would kind of write and tell their story. And if you look at ancient Rome, it was the same thing. They got a little more sophisticated. They were writing things on paper at that point. And so they would tell stories about how they had done this and conquered this and been here, done that, got the t-shirt, and then moved on, right? That's how you tell stories. I remember anytime I would go to a church, we did this thing. So we've got 3 fairly new pastors here at this church. Kelsey and Jonathan in the last few months, and I've only been here about 2 years. And there's this awkward process where we start dating the church. And they look at our resumes and they go, "Oh, well, we see that you've been here and you've done this and you built this ministry and everything's so great." And then we tell us about the church. We make ourselves look as good as we can possibly look, right? Hard to do in my case. Then the church tries to make itself look good. "Well, we're so awesome." And I tell you what, if you could bring your awesomeness and we bring our awesomeness, we could be triple awesome, and we're all going to be so great, and everything's all good, and everything's perfect. Yay, God. Right? That's how things often work. when we tell our story, we often don't put our bad foot forward. We put our best foot forward to show how wonderful we are and how great we are and how wonderful things are going to be. What I love about the Bible, what I love about the Scriptures, what I love about what I'm about to read is that's not at all how they do it in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, or anything in between. Wherever God shows up, ironically, what we find is not a best foot forward at all. We find a very shaky, awkward foot stumbling to the side and then seeing how God responds. So this is the Apostle Paul writing. This is what he says. He's writing to a church like a consultant trying to prove that he can consult them. So we've done this before here at Liberty. I've done it at other churches I've been at. Usually it has to do when you have to do fundraising or something else. But when you need to solve a problem, you bring in a consultant, right? That's how the business world works. Churches are the same. And when you bring in a consultant, do they tell you how bad they are or how good they are? Of course they tell you how good they are. They're like, well, I met with these people and look how great I was and their attendance went up 14,000%. And if I come to you, look at how good, that's how it works. Paul's writing to a church in Corinth. It's a little church. And he's telling them why they should listen to him. And it's not for any reason that you would expect. This is what he says. So I could go on boasting about all my resume and all these other things. I could. But in order to keep me from being conceited, he writes this to the church, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, this is Paul saying this, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That is a tricky verse. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That's not how you and I operate. That's not how the world works. But one of the beautiful things about our God and about the Scriptures that we have is it doesn't operate in a world of fake trying to prove that you're good enough in order to make people like you. Instead of putting your best foot forward from the very beginning, our God and our Scriptures and our family story is one that starts with a shaky foot, and this is how it goes. God made everything good. Like, awesome. It's called the Garden of Eden. And all we had to do was do the right thing and follow God and be with Him. And how does the Bible start? We failed. Most kings don't put that as like chapter 3. They would save that or hide that. And then it goes on, and if you've read the Bible from cover to cover, a few folks have, what you find is not what you expect. This Friday night I was at a wedding for some church folks, and I met a person there who's a part of this church, but I hadn't met before, and she said, Chris, I want you to know, like, I'm reading my Bible. I'm like, you don't have to prove it, you know what I mean? Like, this isn't like I just love you. But she goes, actually, the reason why I read the Bible was because I was so interested. I didn't grow up a Christian, and so I wanted to know all these things about Christianity. And so she picked up her Bible, and she started reading. She says, I wanted to know why some churches do baptism this way. Like, how come we didn't dunk Marley? Why did we just drink, you know what I mean? Why did churches do it that way? She was like, I wanted to know what the devil was all about and what's all that, you know what I mean? So she had all these questions about church, and this is what she discovered, is that when you start reading from the beginning and you go all the way to the end, you don't find hardly anything about any of those things anywhere. Have you noticed that? It doesn't say anything about that. In fact, a lot of the practical questions that people want to talk about when it comes to church, that's what we do over a beer somewhere else. When we talk about the Scriptures and the stories that we find in them, it's actually just one big, giant love story of how God, even in the midst of all the times that they mess up, keeps calling them back home over and over and over and over, from beginning to end. And so the way the stories work is, and you wouldn't expect this in any other ancient text, what they do is they talk about how when God said to do this, we decided no, and we screwed up and we messed up. And then Moses led us out of Egypt. And when we were getting out there, we finally see this big God, and it's incredible, and Moses is leading us out, and we're killing the Egyptian. It's amazing, rah, 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 cool stuff. And then it says, and then when we got to Mount Sinai, we decided it would be a good idea to build a golden calf and totally betray God and then ruin everything. And they write that in. You would think if I was writing my family story, I would have skipped some of these parts, right? And then, of course, you go deeper and deeper into the story, and it's like how God gave us this and told us to go in this way. And we said, no, I'm going to be like a rebellious teenager and fail and fail and fail. And over and over and over this goes. So the story of the Bible isn't one of just, this is what you need to do. The story of the Bible is one where God says, I love you, let's hang out in a garden. And then we say no, and God says, that's okay. I'm going to keep inviting you back home more times than you can ever imagine. There's always a light on in God's house for a runaway teenager that wonders if they can ever come back home after they've left. And so the story of the Bible is a continual one of disobedient children being invited back by a loving God. And so here the Apostle Paul in this story, what he's doing is he's saying, church, I love you and I want to help you and I'm going to give you some advice, but I'm not going to do it out of a place of strength because that would be false. You know, and the Apostle Paul, I don't know if you know very much about him. I mean, he studied at the best schools that you could ever possibly study, like the Ohio States. And he studied with the best people. And he got the best grades. And he memorized the whole Bible. And he never broke any rule. I met someone this week that I was having breakfast with. It was I was one of those people growing up where you took Sunday school attendance and you got badges at the end of the year if you never missed a Sunday. Did any of you grow up in churches like that? Some of you? My own children, and I'm a pastor, would not get any awards. That's okay. But I do know this. There was a culture in the world where you always had to prove that you were good enough, that you were smart enough, that people should like you, and that if you could just pull off this game long enough, maybe you could win. And here the Apostle Paul who after Jesus is right up there with Peter and others that, I mean, when I get to heaven someday, they'll be way up there and I'll be back corner. I'll be hiding in that balcony over there, barely squeaking in. And even the Apostle Paul says this. God loves me so much that he wasn't going to let me be conceited. And there was this thorn in my flesh that I couldn't get out. I had this brokenness and my weakness in my own heart that even I, the Apostle Paul, couldn't fix. And so it's like he's writing on his Facebook bio, Paul, 42-year-old male, lives in this place. I got junk in my life. That's what he's writing here. And the reason why he was okay writing that he was struggling was because he knew that folks shouldn't trust him because he was good. Folks should trust him because he knew how big God was, not how big Paul was. And when he says thorn in the flesh, you should know that scholars debate. We have no idea actually what this thorn in the flesh that Paul's talking about is. I think that was a gift of grace so that we didn't think he was the only one with problems. But do any of you have something that you struggle with that makes you weak? We have two brave people that were This week I was meeting with my spiritual director, and so we meet on Zoom about once a month or so. And one of the things that I love about that relationship with my spiritual director is when we gather, his job is to listen and my job is to talk, So it's one of the few relationships that I have where I don't have to impress anyone. He's just there because I pay him. It's like any good counselor. But he loves me too, and I know that. And he started off our time together where he said, Chris, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to read Psalm 116, and I want you to just think about how this applies to your life. And so this is what he read. He said, I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me, and I was overcome by distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the nervous and the scared. And when I was brought low, when I had thorns in my flesh, when I was weak, when I was terrified, when I was scared, when I was afraid, that's when God showed up. I love our scriptures, and it's one of the reasons why I think I can trust them more than anything else in the world, is because they're not afraid to be real about things not working out, because that's my story. When Paul says that he had a thorn in the flesh, fill in the blank with what you think that might have been for Paul. And I don't know the answer, but I can fill in the blank, for I know what many of us struggle with here at Liberty and in our culture. For some folks, their thorn in the flesh, or maybe your thorn in the flesh, is just rampant self-doubt. Where everywhere you walk in, you feel like you're trying to impress folks, but you know that beneath the surface, if anyone really knew how much you doubted yourself, once they found you out and your imposter syndrome came through, right? For some folks, that's their thorn. For some folks that come to church, I know this is their thorn. They try to pretend like they're a Christian, but deep down inside they have all kinds of doubts about how things work, but they're too afraid to admit that they have doubts, and so they just cover it up by talking the talk and walking the walk and never really dealing with the stuff that's going on in their hearts and in their minds. For some folks, you go through life and the thorn in your flesh is the fact that even though on paper it looks like you have a beautiful family, underneath the surface everything is falling apart and people don't talk to each other. Husbands and wives and others are just this close to everything falling and breaking apart. Some folks I know are so stressed with anxiety and things going on in their lives that the only hope that they have of making it through the day is enough alcohol and drugs at night in order to get a good night's sleep. And there are folks in our congregation that struggle with addictions to all kinds of things, including pornography and drug abuse and alcohol abuse, and you name it. There are folks in this congregation that have thorns in their flesh of abuse, either of things that have happened to them, where if they told folks what had happened to them, they're afraid that no one would love them anymore. I don't even have to scratch the surface to start naming these things, do I? But we all have thorns. And the temptation anytime you have a thorn, just like Paul, is to say, I'm going to hide it. Because the only thing worse than people knowing what's going on is maybe they would know and then they would judge me. Or maybe they would know and then they wouldn't love me. And so I'm going to hide, and I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to be fake. The sermon series that we're doing over the next couple weeks is called Know and the Power of Vulnerability. And it's lifting up one of our core values at Liberty of authenticity. And authenticity is a buzzword that a lot of corporations use and everyone else uses. Around here, it is not a buzzword. It's rooted in the truth of the Scriptures about us, that all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God in so many ways. And that the good news is that even while we were still sinners, Jesus looked at us, loved us, died for us, and said, there's still a light on in my church for you who have doubts, who have thorns, and are broken. And so when we talk about being a church who is authentic, what we're really talking about is this: of all places in the world, should be the safest place that you could ever be, because here you don't meet people where you're the only one going through something. You meet people that are broken too, that will love you unconditionally. Part of my dream for what a church should be, and this isn't just me, this is all pastors everywhere. But the real dream for a church isn't that we gather on Sundays, we have chicken barbecue together, and we're all just this much chubbier when we're done, and we know each other even less. We do these chicken barbecues and other things to celebrate our history, which is awesome. And we do it really, though, so that there's a moment after the service where people start bumping into one another to build relationships. Because it's easy to talk about authenticity, and we all need to get real with one another and be vulnerable. And if we, during that question time where we asked you to stand and greet your neighbor, what if we said, hey, turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself, and tell them your greatest weakness? That's not a church you want to be a part of. It would feel fake, it would feel awkward, it wouldn't work, and it would border on voyeurism. That's just not real. The only way it works is if slowly, gradually, you meet people and you're like, hey, you know what? I think I'd like to journey alongside these folks. And we've got new members joining us today, and one of the things that we do in our new member class that's really important to Liberty is the first class we meet, and we tell them a little bit about the church's story, and of course then they have all kinds of questions, well, like, what does the church believe about politics? How does the, you know what I mean, like all the dirt. So we show all the dirt, and that's good, because all churches have dirt. All churches have dirt. And then the next class that we do with our new members is we say, and let's tell our stories. You know what I mean? Let's tell our stories. And of course, we have a few of our own elders that are at those meetings, and they model it for the church, where they tell folks what's going on. And I'll tell you this, for those of you that were in that class, it took 30 seconds until we were joining with one another in our brokenness and telling stories of hurt. And it felt safe, and it felt good, and it felt real, and that was okay, but we also knew that was just the beginning. God's vision of the church is a place where you and I don't have to hide who we are, because trust me, God already knows. But what we can do is we can live life like Paul, where we can say, I delight in my weaknesses, for when I am weak, I am strong. One of our visions here at Liberty is that this would be a place where grace is always found. That sounds good, doesn't it, right? A place where grace is always found. But you will never find grace if you don't ask for it. And you'll never find grace if you don't need it. And so how can we be a community of grace if everyone around here is doing just fine? Well, the way we become a community of grace is being authentic, of being honest with our sin and our brokenness and the things that are going on. And this is that little twist where the church moves from the world to being actually a spiritual community, is when someone, instead of putting their best foot forward, when someone in the church takes a wobbly step and says, actually, I'm not doing so great today, and my kids aren't talking to me, and I could use some help. And in the world, when you confess your weakness or your brokenness or your sins or your failures, what often happens is folks move away from you. Or they say, I don't think I want that to be my story, or I can't associate myself with someone like that. So in the world, we only choose winners. In the church, we embrace losing. We confess our failures. We admit our weaknesses, not because it's easy and not because we enjoy it. It's because when I say I need help, that gives God an opportunity to take that crack inside of our life and open it big enough for Him to come through and show Himself. And so we as a community, if we're doing church right, are a safe enough place where we can confess our brokenness and our weakness and then see where and how God, who is the Lord of the universe, comes through and shows His grace and His mercy and His love. So my hope and my prayer for our church as we talk about these things is that you'll go to a chicken barbecue. That's good. That is a baby step. And the next baby step is signing up for one of those groups or a Bible study or getting involved in something. That's the next act of vulnerability. And then once you've met a bunch of people and you start to know their names, do you tell them anything vulnerable about yourself yet? I wouldn't. It takes time. It takes courage. And it takes knowing that people will be with you through that process. That's the kind of church that we want to be. I invite you to bow your heads and to pray with me. God, in a world full of pride, in a world full of best foots forward, thank you for letting us be a shaky foot church of half-hearted people that want to be all in for you. Would you allow us and give us the grace to be a community where we find you, where we're not afraid of being real, and where above all, God, you show your face even when we don't expect it. And we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.